Hello again, this is Elena Любимцева. I will be talking to you today about landscape matrix, and of course this is lecture 4 in GPY 410, Landscape Analysis and Green Infrastructure. Just want to remind you very quickly that we are continuing working with a book by Landscape Ecology by Foreman and Gordon, and this week we are working with Chapter 5. It is available on the Blackboard. If you have any difficulties with PDF, please let me know. And the title of this chapter is Matrix and Network. We will be also using a section called Mosaic from Landscape Ecology Principles in Landscape Architecture and Land Use Planning by Drumstad, Olsen, and Foreman. So we're continuing working with this book. Please work on your own through the case studies. This will greatly help us during the lab and during the third quiz this week. Out of all the three landscape elements, patches, corridors, and matrix, matrix is by far the most dominant one. And it really has these three major criteria helping us to identify it. First of all, it's the most extensive in terms of its area. It's also the most connected landscape type, and it plays the most dominant role in landscape functioning. So if we want to plan in our landscape or manage our landscape right, this planning really starts from envisioning sustainability of the landscape matrix. Whatever kind of the landscape you are in, urban, rural, suburban, any landscape really is determined by what's going on in its matrix. It can be an area of development, it can be an entirely pristine and natural area, it can be developed area, buildings of Paris with patches of small green spaces and street corridors, or a tundra of northern Canada, but it's really this dominant matrix that is defining what kind of processes are happening in the landscape. So this diagram really illustrates the relationships between matrix, patches, and corridors, and you can see that matrix is really where all patches and corridors are embedded inside. So I would like to highlight again the three major criteria of what is matrix within any landscape. And of course, this is true at any scale of observation. We have to remember that in landscape ecology, we are always thinking of a landscape pattern at a certain scale of your observations. So as you determine what is the scale, that would help you really to see what is the matrix, what are the corridors, and what are the patches in your study area. If we zoom in or if we zoom out, what we perceive as matrix at a certain scale can become a patch at a different scale, or it can become even a part of the corridor or at the third scale. So always remember that the scale of observations determines the grain of our landscape. This is just to keep in mind. So the three criteria of what is a matrix is really its size, its connectivity, and the degree of control over landscape dynamics and all processes within the landscape. A matrix is always the largest element within any landscape. It's larger than each type of patches and each type of corridors in terms of the area that they occupy. And it's also the most connected landscape element compared to patches and even corridors, even though corridors are also sometimes extremely well connected when they form networks. And so what is perhaps the most important, that matrix determines a variety of different processes. It determines landscape dynamics. It controls microclimate. It controls hydrological regime within the landscape. It determines what kind of species can live there. In terms of human perception, it also determines the recreational potential, or in general any kind of development potential. It controls the way how we feel within the landscape. It has impact on our well-being, and it also determines the landscape aesthetics. As you perhaps remember from the previous lectures, in landscape ecology, it is sometimes very useful to use the so-called landscape metrics. The landscape metrics are very simple geometrical indices that help us to measure the relationship among different landscape elements within the landscape, their size, the way how they're interconnected. So for example, connectivity would be one of the indices which is important for understanding our corridors. Or we spoke before about edges and the shape of individual patches or connectivity among different patches. So there is a number of landscape indices or landscape metrics that would apply to the entire landscape, to the landscape mosaic, and they would also apply to the description of the landscape matrix. Here are some examples of those indices. The density of patches, right? The landscape can consist of a matrix and a variety of different patches, and so how densely those patches distributed within a surrounding matrix would determine what kind of species can live there, what kind of land use we can have there. So it will help us just to understand what is the role of different types of landscape elements as patches in their connection to matrix. Richness shows us what is the share, what is the proportion of different types, what is the diversity of different types of patches within the landscape mosaic. Landscape porosity. So remember this index because it basically shows how many pores, how many holes are within the matrix. The matrix is connected, but it is interrupted by different other elements, different types of patches, and different types of corridors. So you can think about it as porosity of our landscape, porosity of our matrix. Proportional abundance, what is the ratio of different types of landscape elements within the landscape. Diversity. Boundary shape, which is essentially like the shape of the edge that separates different types of patches or corridors, and the matrix. And we already spoke why is it important before, because some species actually prefer to live along the edge and other species prefer to live far away of those edges. So they will be much better off either within the matrix, away from patches, or inside of those patches. Edge can be sometimes also described by the metrics of contrast that essentially tells us how significant is the difference between the landscape patch and the landscape matrix. Think of the difference between dense forest and light forest versus a dense forest and arable land. In the second case, in the latter case, we have much stronger contrast between arable land and the dense forest. In the former case, light forest versus dense forest, it's kind of a little bit blurry, right? So there's less contrast, and there's less contrast in terms of the habitat preference for species who live there. Spatial configuration, again, we spoke before about the shape of individual patches within the landscape, but it also affects those boundaries between patches and the matrix, right? The more convoluted those boundaries are, the more convoluted our edges, the more habitat we actually have for the edge species and less habitat we have for the interior species. If you think about human use, again, some very convoluted configurations might be less suitable for certain land uses, such as building houses, but they can be extremely well suitable for, let's say, mountain biking within the landscape, right, where you want to see lots of contrast within a fairly dense area. Proximity of patches, again, it will tell us what the distance we should travel from one place to another, or individual species should travel, and of course connectivity, how different landscape elements are connected. Again, you can think of this landscape matrix from the perspective of animal species or from the perspective of landscape development for different purposes for humans. If you are planning the itinerary for the 5K and you want to kind of grasp, or 25K if you are a much better runner than I, you would actually want to capture much more landscape diversity within fairly small area and make the itinerary really interesting. Or if you are planning a hiking trail versus if you are choosing a fairly homogeneous area for let's say residential development, and at the same time you want to have this residential development close enough to the nearest green spaces. So you might want to think about connectivity by some green belts that would be connected to patches that you would want to dedicate for your residential development areas. So you might ask why we're talking about it, why all this is really important. Is it important? Well, it is important because, as I said before, the matrix really what determines the health and the balance and the harmony within the landscape. When the landscape matrix is becoming exceedingly fragmented, the entire landscape is going to change. This is kind of your, the element that controls everything. It controls microclimate, it controls diversity of species, it controls types of soils, it controls your hydrology. So if an area has been broken either by disturbance, natural or human, or by intentional pattern of development, by too much of introduced elements, but patches of the remaining patches of what used to be a matrix are still fairly closely together, they might be still dense enough to support the initial structure of the landscape, and they might still be useful for habitat connectivity and animal species within the movement. They might also preserve whatever was the land use of the area for humans. But if you open a very large area, let's say if we open a large forested area by creating huge openings in it, then the patches might be just too small and too disconnected, too fragmented to sustain certain species. They might be even be not suitable for supporting any kind of human activity that was initially intended in this area. So you have heard, I'm sure you have heard before about the landscape fragmentation, and we speak about landscape fragmentation much less than we speak about climate change, but this is really just probably as big of an issue all over the world. It's changing our landscapes too quickly, sometimes not in a very planned, not in a sustainable way at all. So we really need to be aware of landscape fragmentation. Sometimes it's open doors for so many unintended environmental issues that are simply a result of poor land use planning or poor urban planning. So this is a hypothetical example showing us what is happening in this very simple example of landscape fragmentation. Let's say we start with a forest matrix, and you know, of course, that forest matrix, forest landscape is never completely homogeneous. It simply means here that the majority of the area is occupied by forest. This is the largest, the most connected, the most prevailing landscape element that controls all the processes within the landscape. And then we humans come and we start agricultural activity, and we first start this agricultural activity just in certain areas. So here's a farm here, and here's another farm there, and so we have more and more of those agricultural lands. Initially, they are patches. They break the original forest matrix, and it's still forest, right? But we see more and more agricultural patches. Essentially, over time, all these agricultural patches come together and they become connected, and we see that this area now has way more farmland than what used to be a forest. We might still have some remnant patches of the forest, and at this time, the landscape dynamic has changed completely. What used to be introduced patches became the entire matrix, and what used to be the residue of our forest matrix became occasional remnant patches that are still preserved within the landscape. You can imagine how different is this area from the initial area. Even if this is still the same place, but let's say 30 years ago, 30 years later, we have here completely different climate, completely different hydrology, completely different species can live there, and this is really entirely new area, even though we still have some forest and we still have some agriculture within the same place. This couple of orthophotos would actually show how this process is happening over time. You can simply compare this to air photos of eastern Kentucky. The first area shows us the same area. We can clearly see that the most predominant land cover here is still forest matrix, and this forest matrix is highly fragmented by mining, by agriculture, and by human habitat. Still, it's still prevalent. As we are looking at the same area just a few years ago, with the next air flight, you can clearly see that what used to be the matrix is now other remnant patches of forest, and what used to be the disturbance or introduced patches became this open land matrix. So the landscape, it's kind of the same landscape, but it has changed dramatically in terms of its microclimate, in terms of its hydrology, and in terms of its habitat for a variety of species, or for the land use as well. The next couple of photos illustrate the landscape fragmentation and the resulting landscape transformation here in the area close to our campus. So I took this and the next picture in the Grand Ravines. If you go there for a walk just next to campus, you might want to notice it along the trail. And so this is just from one of the information science showing what is happening in the area adjacent to the ravine and adjacent to our campus. If you look at the picture on the left, this is the pre-European settlement forest, a hardwood forest that has been all around our campus before 1920. And then in the 1920s, this area became occupied by farmlands. Essentially, we have lots of agricultural land use here all over, over the century from 1920 to 2011. And then as Ottawa County purchased this area and started restoration, they were able to restore the original grassland. You probably remember my little field trip for the Lab 1, where we were looking actually at those areas of restoration with regenerated grassland within this area. And so you can see how the landscape has changed, being totally fragmented from the forest, becoming agriculture, changing completely. And then now we see those patches of restored grassland within the matrix, which is still primarily farmland around our area. So I found out also that 99.9% of grassland ecosystems in Michigan Lower Peninsula has been lost as a result of landscape fragmentation caused by farming. And so this map actually shows us that what used to be the predominant land cover in the pre-settlement time, today grassland is available only within small patches of restored and protected areas. And so here is this our little area close to campus where I was doing the Lab 1 with you, and this is where I took this picture in the Grand Ravine. So this is one of the very few patches where we can find the native grassland in West Michigan. So we spoke before about heterogeneity of the landscape, right? The more different types of elements we have within a landscape, the more heterogeneous it is. So an example of heterogeneous landscape would be a landscape that includes forest and grassland and maybe some patches of man-made land uses such as arable lands or human settlements versus a homogeneous landscape that would be, let's say, one huge parking lot. And so you can clearly see that heterogeneous landscape always has much better potential, both in terms of biodiversity, but also as a resource for humans. The higher is landscape heterogeneity, the more stable is usually the landscape as a system. So the system analysis really tells us that complex systems are diverse system, and the more diverse is the system, the more stable it is. And so when the landscape is exposed to disturbance, such as landscape fragmentation, this disturbance might damage one or two areas, but it would not wipe out the entire landscape pattern, and it would not wipe out all habitat for species who live there, just because there is enough of diversity, there's enough of complexity within the system. So the more heterogeneous is the area, the more resilient it is to those diversity. On the other hand, if let's say we had a very homogeneous planted area, we just have one species, that forest plantation that is essentially composed of one type of landscape and one type of land cover with one species. If this area is exposed to disturbance, it would be just wiped out, by a disease or by a forest fire. It would not. It would have extremely low resilience. So this is really the reason why heterogeneity of the landscape is important, and we need to protect this heterogeneity of different land cover types to maximize the resiliency of the entire system for the species who live there and for ourselves. So the damage to wildlife is much greater in the areas that are less complex. So we always have to remember about heterogeneity and connectivity of different elements within the landscape structure. And the more those elements are connected, the more the matrix is connected, the more stable is the system. Here are a couple of examples from air photos showing us landscape transformation due to fragmentation of the matrix. So what we see here is a tropical rainforest in Brazil in 1996. You clearly see some disturbances. We see all these introduced patches associated with agriculture. We see some introduced corridors in tropical rainforest associated with the roads, and most of disturbances are really happening along those roads. On the right, you see all this cyan color, which is showing us agricultural areas. Clearly, the disturbance is everywhere, and introduced patches are also everywhere. So the forest has been cleared. You have plenty of agricultural lands, and it's kind of sprawling all over. And so just like in those more hypothetical diagrams that I was showing you before, as arable land is replacing the forest matrix, you can clearly see that this is a new matrix with completely different climate and with completely different hydrology that has established over this area. And look, like this happened over 4 years. So this is a very dramatic change. Remote sensing in the sense is extremely useful because you can document those changes. And here you can see that the matrix of tropical rainforest is really disappearing in front of our. And so it is quite well documented in the literature on landscape ecology that adjacent habitats affect each other through changes in microclimate, in hydrology, in transfer of nutrients, materials, seeds, species themselves, genetic exchange among the communities. So heterogeneity is really, really important, and as we are changing the matrix, the entire landscape is changing. So these changes ultimately affect all ecological processes, such as the gene flow, the species composition in each community within the landscape. And so this landscape fragmentation, as you probably know, is the primary cause of the loss of biodiversity, along with climate change. So again, I probably would put the landscape fragmentation almost at the same level as climate change in terms of the urgency that we need to address it. But I would say, I think that right now people are probably paying attention much less to this problem, even though this is a huge problem all over the world and we are losing many native landscapes that are extremely important for protecting biodiversity and species. As you know, that many species are disappearing as we speak because of landscape fragmentation. Here is another pair of quite old satellite images. I chose them because, again, they show how quickly tropical rainforest is disappearing as a result of landscape fragmentation. So you also see very close images in terms of time, right? They're 7 years apart. This is a case study in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where you can see how, again, the tropical rainforest matrix is becoming agricultural field. So what used to be arable land, what used to be patches of arable land is becoming the new matrix of the landscape. And of course, it's triggering all kinds of changes. We see lots of these changes here in the United States, of course, especially when we are opening our national parks to mining or to other resource extractions that damages the matrix of the entire national park. We see all those changes in many other parts of the world. I've been thinking about the tar sand oil extraction in Canada, and there's this entire horrific matrix that is associated just with oil extraction from tar sands in the areas that used to be occupied by prairie or by forests. So to conclude, landscape fragmentation causes dry microclimates in the entire landscape. It also alters species composition in favor of invasive species. It increases vulnerabilities of remaining patches to disturbances. It also exacerbates a loss of forest interior wildlife species. It causes the loss of the core within the matrix or within the major patches. I mentioned here forest, but the same would apply to any kind of natural landscape. It also increases edge effect. The more fragmentation, the more edge we have. It also reduces the genetic diversity of the remaining populations, uh, leading to dramatic loss of biodiversity within the entire landscape. And it also leads to further fragmentation. So essentially, fragmentation that starts with disturbance then makes the landscape even more vulnerable to future fragmentation because of the areas that it's going to trigger either through natural or anthropogenic disturbances. So this is all for today. I hope that you would think about some of those questions as you are looking at your own case study areas and as you are developing your own projects. So for this week, I want to invite you to think about these three major questions as you are navigating your study areas. What is the matrix of your study area? Is your study area affected by landscape fragmentation? And what kind of changes are happening in the landscape of your study area, either through fragmentation or maybe through some other disturbances or through some other processes? And we will come back to more of those questions in the Lab 3. So stay tuned for my tutorial and also for the directions on the Blackboard for the Lab 3 for this week. Thank you, and I will see you on Zoom.